Hi everyone, I'm happy to welcome you to this beginner tutorial on the basics of working in Nomad Sculpt. You can follow along with me if you'd like. Just pause and rewind the video whenever you need, or simply watch and learn at your own pace. So, let's get started. When you first open Nomad Sculpt, by default, you'll see a sphere like this. Most likely, if it's your first time launching the app, the sphere will appear all white. Nomad Sculpt has two main shading modes, lit and matcap. Lit displays realistic lighting, shadows, and materials, but it also puts more load on your device. Matcap, on the other hand, uses fixed lighting and is better for sculpting. It's easier to see the shape, it runs faster, and it saves battery life. So, the first thing I recommend is to switch from lit PBR to matcap mode. To do this, tap on the sun icon to open the lighting menu. Then change the shading mode to matcap. Now, you can choose any of the available matcaps that you like. I have some custom matcaps, so my list might be a bit longer than yours. But don't worry, that's not important. Just keep in mind that when your model is completely finished and you want to create a nice render, you'll need to switch back to lit mode. By default, symmetry is already turned on. If not, you can activate it with this button. The standard symmetry is along the x-axis. Right now, I have the brush tool selected, so I can start sculpting. You've probably noticed that tapping the surface creates raised or indented areas. Let's go over some of the basic tools and controls you'll need while sculpting. If you simply press the stylus to the model, it creates a raised area. If you press while holding this invert button, it creates an indentation instead. Holding down the smooth button lets you smooth out the surface. Pretty simple. We'll go over the rest of the tools as we continue through the lesson. To adjust the brush size, you can use this slider or swipe up and down with 3 fingers on the screen if that gesture is enabled in your settings. This second slider changes the brush intensity, basically how strong or aggressive the brush is. You can also switch between adding and subtracting material in advance. By default, the brush tool is set to add material, but you can always change it to subtract mode here. Sometimes the icon may look different, but the function is the same. Of course, like in any other program, you can undo or redo your actions while sculpting. Tap with 2 fingers to undo or 3 fingers to redo. You can do this as many times as you need. You can also use the arrows on the bottom panel, or open the full action history to jump back or forward several steps at once. Now that we've created some rough shapes and basic forms, I hope you're experimenting along with me. And maybe you've already come up with the first sketches of some strange, never before seen creatures. Let's talk a bit more about the interface and navigation in Nomad Sculpt. If you tap this button in the top menu, you'll change how the brush panel is displayed. You can choose a single column view where you scroll up and down to find the brush you want, or you can switch to a multi-column view so that all the brushes are visible at once. You can also drag this little corner to adjust how many columns are shown. For example, I personally prefer having 4 columns. At the top left of the screen, we also have buttons that open different side panels. Inside these panels, you can scroll through the tools and settings. By default, the panel closes automatically after you make a selection. But if you want the panel to stay open, tap the pin icon. This will keep the panel visible at all times, giving you quicker access while sculpting. In the top right corner, you'll see an icon showing the currently selected brush. Tapping on it opens that brush's settings, if it has any. Not every brush has settings, but many of them do. So it's worth checking out. As for navigation, using your finger or your stylus directly on the canvas, you can rotate the camera around your model. Use 2 fingers to pan. That is, move the view up, down, left or right. A pinch gesture will let you zoom in or out, bringing you closer to or farther from the model. I also recommend checking whether perspective view is turned off. Open the camera settings and choose orthographic for now. You can also change the rotation mode to trackball, which I find more intuitive. Later, when you're ready to render or showcase your model, you can enable and tweak perspective settings. Another very useful navigation feature is the view cube. Tapping different sides of the cube lets you quickly switch to top, bottom, front, left or right views. If you hold your finger on one of the cube faces, you can lock the view so it won't rotate accidentally. Tap the cube again to unlock it. There are also helpful navigation buttons next to the cube. If you zoomed in or out too much or lost track of your model, just tap the frame icon to recenter the model in the viewport. The home icon resets the model back to its default home position. And one last tip for interface control: tapping the screen with 4 fingers hides all the UI panels. Tap with 4 fingers again to bring them back. Now, I suggest taking a short break and trying out some sculpting on your own. Start with a simple sketch using the basic brushes like clay, brush, move, crease, smooth. You might also find the trim tool useful. Let's stick with these for now. They'll be our main tools in the beginning. It's time to experiment and start creating something unique. Alright, after a quick warm-up, I ended up with a head like this. I think you've got something similar, maybe even better. Now here's a situation we need to address, or more precisely, a problem, which is uneven detail density or even lack of detail in certain areas. So, how can we solve this problem? Let's figure it out. First, you need to understand this key point. The main method of increasing detail is by adding more points. In other words, increasing the number of polygons. If we press this button at the bottom, we can see that our model is made up of many little squares. These are the polygons, and the structure looks like a grid. If we go into the multi-resolution section, we'll see that our sphere already has 2 subdivision levels by default. To increase the density of this grid, we need to press Subdivide. After clicking this button, you'll notice another level of detail appears on the slider. This slider allows us to go down to a lower subdivision level and back up again. So what exactly happens when we subdivide a polygon? Let's say we start with a square. Every time we press Subdivide, it's split into 4 smaller squares. Each edge gets an additional point in the center, and those points are connected to form 4 new quads. The same logic applies to triangles. Each edge gets a point in the middle, and as a result, the triangle is split into 3 quads when using Subdivide. Once we've added more points, we can refine the surface and work on finer details. Let's say I add small wrinkles or folds or something like that. I can always, for instance, go down to a lower subdivision level, select the Move brush and adjust the shape a bit. At the same time, all the fine details we created at the higher level will stay intact. Also, smoothing the model is much easier on a lower level than trying to erase details at a high multi-resolution level. Once I fix the shape, I can go back up at any moment and see that the fine details haven't gone anywhere. Ideally, you should add details step by step. First, make a few strokes on the second level. Then move one level up and refine further. Don't go overboard pressing the Subdivide button, because the higher the mesh density, the more stress it puts on your system. Great. As you can see, this is how I improved the detailing, and now I can continue working. We also haven't yet covered one important brush, or actually 2 brushes, but with the same functionality. These are the mask and cell mask brushes. The main purpose of these brushes is to create masked areas on the surface of the model where you won't be able to manipulate the geometry. You can select the mask brush from the quick access panel on the left by pressing the mask button, or you can hold it down with your finger while you apply the mask. Once you release it, you will no longer be masking the object. As soon as you select it, a new menu will appear at the top with mask settings and controls. It's also worth mentioning that this brush has a lot of other interesting and useful options in its settings. I might talk more about them later. So, let's say I mask the lower part of the head by holding the mask button. A black area will appear. Now, if I start sculpting, for example, up here, the lower area won't be affected. let me go back a couple of subdivision levels. Let's say I want to mask the eye sockets, for example. That way, I can add a bit of volume to the brow ridge. To erase the mask, I can tap the unmask button over here and then use the stylus to erase part of it or remove it completely. To clear the entire mask, I can tap Clear All in this menu. Or if I have the Cell Mask brush selected, I can simply swipe the stylus in an empty area without touching the model, and that will completely remove the mask. This is a basic technique you need to know. Let's go back to the Mask Settings menu. There's a button to invert the mask. You can also do the same by tapping in an empty area. If you want to make the mask a bit sharper, you can tap the Sharpen button. Or simply tap a few times on the unmasked area of the model. Blurring the mask is also pretty simple. Just press the Blur button or drag this control here, which works like a slider, or tap and enter the blur value manually. Another way to blur the mask is to tap on the mask itself several times. This will soften it. This is the basic set of tools you'll need to understand and use during your work. In any case, as we go through the rest of the lesson, we'll cover a few more functions from this menu. But for now, we'll stop here. For example, we can use a mask to refine a specific area. Most often, I use it when working with various folds. Let's say I want to refine a certain zone or create some overhangs, like I'm showing right now. I invert the mask and use the Inflate brush. I'll add a bit of volume here to form a fold, and with the Move brush I'll adjust it slightly. As you can see, the mask is a very useful and essential tool in the workflow. With its help, we can achieve great and very precise results. For example, I'll do the following. I'll mask an area of the neck, somewhere here. Then I'll invert the mask, switch to the Move brush, increase its size, and pull it out like this, which gives me something resembling a neck. I remove the mask and smooth out the area calmly. As you've probably noticed, we've ended up with a rather noticeable artifact. If I enable the wireframe view, you'll see that the mesh here is extremely stretched. As I mentioned earlier, the quality of your model, in terms of detail and refinement, depends on the mesh density and its evenness. If I continue increasing the number of subdivision levels as before, I'll run into a not so great situation. The subdivision will be applied evenly across the entire model, and where there are already a lot of polygons, there will be even more, and I don't really need that. Why would I need so many polygons on the top of the head, for example, just to add detail? Let's say I want to work on the folds around the ears. How can I solve this? Well, I'll first tweak the shape a little. And while you're either following along or just watching the process, I'll say this: multi-resolution isn't the only tool that lets us work with the model. Actually, for a primary sketch, I recommend using another function, and it's called Voxel remesher. Right now, we're going the hard way, a path that every artist working with Nomad Sculpt needs to understand. Specifically, the idea that there is a process of subdividing the model into additional polygons, and there's a tool that recalculates the mesh. So we have a section called Voxel remesher, which is used to recalculate the density of our mesh. In other words, to make it completely uniform. This Voxel button does the same thing as the Remesh button in the top menu. But if you press and hold the Voxel button, a pop-up menu with settings appears. Now, let's say we set the resolution to 256, and I recommend not going overboard with this value. And then press the remesh button. If you have subdivision levels, a warning will pop up that these levels will be lost. We press OK, and the model is recalculated. I'll enable wireframe view now, and you'll see that the mesh has become perfectly even. It's an excellent sketching tool that really helps in the workflow. After that, we can continue sculpting without issues. So what's the point? Take a look. If I now pull the ears down, you'll see a very strong polygon stretch. This means I won't be able to sculpt any folds there. You can see how badly the surface deforms. But now, since I'm using Voxel Remesher, I can just click the Voxel button again, and the mesh will be recalculated. It's that simple. Now pay attention, when you sculpt on very thin surfaces, this can happen. Just as an example, I'll grab a big crease brush and run it along one side. You'll see that it pushes through to the other side. Basically, we're affecting both sides of the surface at once. To make it affect only one side, we need to adjust the brush a bit. Go over here, switch to the Filter tab, and check the Front-Facing Vertex Only option. That way, the brush will affect only the front part of the mesh, and the back faces won't deform. The same applies to masking. In the mask settings here, you can also enable Front Vertex. There are plenty of brushes here. I think by now you're starting to find the ones that feel the most interesting and comfortable for you. Probably the final touch in our current discussion about brushes is this. Every brush can be slightly customized. Let's treat this as a small experimental process for now. Let's say you pick the clay brush. Try changing how it interacts with the surface. For example, you can test out the roll mode or lock, turn on the randomize option. In general, you can experiment with the settings and see how they change the brush. You probably noticed this square icon. It's called an alpha. It defines the shape of the stroke you're using. You can change the alpha by clicking here and selecting any of the available options. Or you can press the Import button to upload your own custom image. It can be a regular colored image. The system will convert it to black and white. The light areas will be raised, while the dark areas will remain flat in comparison. You can change the alpha shape and cover your model with tiny details. But before diving deep into fine detailing, always remember that the process should go from large forms to small ones, never the other way around. No amount of detail or refinement will ever solve issues with composition or mass. Any brush that you've customized can be reset to its default settings by tapping on it again and selecting Reset in the menu that appears. Alright, let's move on to another practice session and start adding details to our model. Great! Another stage of our model development is complete, and it's time to move forward. We've experimented with the Voxel remesher, sculpted using different brushes, and you've probably noticed that using the Voxel remesher, as I mentioned earlier, gives us a relatively uniform mesh. But sometimes you might want to increase the level of detail in certain areas, or across the entire model. You already know that increasing the resolution value does exactly that. The model becomes more polygon dense and ready for finer detail. We can also press the regular subdivide button in the multi-resolution panel. You'll notice that the mesh density increases and a slider appears. Now we can use a brush like crease to refine the model, add subtle detailing, wrinkles, folds, basically work in a calm, meditative way on the sculpt we're building. But there are a few nuances to keep in mind. If we use the multi-resolution feature and then later apply Voxel remesher, the system will revert the model back to a uniform mesh based on the current resolution value. For example, 256, and all subdivision levels will be lost. Let's roll back a few steps. There's a particular workflow some artists use, and I use it too, from time to time. Let's say we lower the resolution to 128 and remesh the model. Now we have a rough sketch. We can freely manipulate its proportions using the Move brush, reshape, stretch, adjust. Once we've blocked out the silhouette and main volumes, we can start subdividing. Press Subdivide to add more geometry and refine details. Then press it again and refine even further, step by step. The advantage of this workflow is that the system handles models with multiple subdivision levels quite efficiently. However, there are downsides. As you can see, some ugly artifacts can start to appear. This happens because at the lowest subdivision level, some polygons end up twisted or angled, which is clearly visible. These diamond-shaped faces tend to cause unpleasant results during sculpting, and if we step back further, we'll see a very loose mesh. It's hard to smooth, and not very convenient to work with. So yes, there are trade-offs. On the other hand, we can always drop back to the lowest level, fix proportions, then return to higher levels, and continue detailing. But if we use the Voxel remesher again, as mentioned, it will completely rebuild the mesh. If you want to preserve your current level of detail, you'll have to increase the resolution value. For example, set it to 600 before remeshing. This will keep the detail, but it will also increase the processing time. Once the Voxel remesher finishes recalculating the geometry, you'll be able to smooth it out freely and continue working. The great thing about Voxel remesher is that you can start from a simple sphere, from something like virtual clay, and sculpt a complete figure of any size, and it will be evenly divided into polygons of equal size throughout. Let's go back a few steps and take a look at another way to add detail to our model. As you've seen, the combination of remesher and subdivide works really well, especially on models that started with low resolution. But now it's worth diving into another tool, dynamic topology, or DynTopo. How does it work and what is it useful for? To demonstrate it, I'll select the clay brush. That'll make things clearer. And then I'll enable the DynTopo toggle right here. Perfect. As you begin sculpting in this mode, you will notice that certain areas seem to become a bit more detailed. It's not always immediately obvious. But let's reduce the brush size, turn on the wireframe view, and make a few strokes. Now let's zoom in, and you'll see that in DynTopo mode, we get a much denser mesh. By default, the density depends on the brush size. The smaller the brush, the finer the detail it creates. The larger the brush, the bigger and coarser the detail it generates. This behavior also works with some other brushes. For example, the smooth brush. Let's go back to the crease brush, for instance. In DynTopo mode, we can carve in extremely fine details and continue refining our sketch. bringing it to a much higher quality look. So, what else affects how DynTopo behaves? In this settings panel, you'll find a slider that controls mesh density. Below it, you'll see options for how detail level is calculated. For example, switching from the default radius mode to constant means brush size will no longer influence the detail. Instead, the level of detail will only depend on this slider. This slider is what controls the overall mesh density. Try experimenting with it. You'll see how it affects your sculpting. Here's another neat trick. Let's say you select the smooth brush, then set its intensity to 0. Now, as you simply paint over the model, you'll increase the mesh density locally in just the areas you touch. Once that's done, you can disable DynTopo and continue sculpting in that area with more precision. Just don't forget to set the smooth brush intensity back to 100 afterward. Now I'll roll back a couple of steps before we apply those changes so we can explore a few more workflow tips. But for now, take a break and feel free to practice and experiment with these tools. And start picking out the brushes that feel the most comfortable and useful for you personally. Alright, now the model looks a bit more refined. I hope your models are also starting to look better. So let's move on and talk about how to add new elements to the current scene. It's very simple. This button here is called Scene. When you tap on it, a menu opens showing you all the objects in your current scene. You can see what your scene is made of, all the individual objects. Here you can clone, delete, or add new primitives by tapping the plus icon. For example, I'll add a sphere. Now you can see we have a second object in the scene. The selected object is highlighted. That means this is the one you're currently working on. You can switch between objects either by selecting them in the list or just by tapping them directly in the workspace. As soon as you add a new primitive to the scene, you can't sculpt on it right away. You need to press the Validate button first. By default, every new subtool you add comes with symmetry enabled on the x-axis. By the way, I recommend experimenting with radial symmetry. It's a really fun tool. Let's try it out. I'll choose the z-axis. Set the number of points to, say, 6. Choose Local Method, disable the axis X, and start sculpting something like this. We get this simple but interesting form. I think with time, you'll find your own creative uses for this tool. Now, once we've added a new object to the scene, you'll notice it appears right in the center of the world, so we need to move it into position. I'll go ahead and turn off radial symmetry and just leave regular x-axis symmetry active. Now, of course, we could use the move brush to reposition the object, but that's not ideal because it distorts the geometry instead of moving the entire object cleanly. So instead, let's choose the gizmo tool. If your model is very large and the new object is tiny, you might have trouble seeing what you're doing. In that case, enable X-ray mode. I disabled apparently this button from the bottom menu, but it can be returned. If you tap and hold the X-ray button, you'll get a pop-up menu where you can adjust its behavior. For example, set it to only make unselected objects transparent. That way, you can better see and edit your new object. Here's a tip. When moving objects, try not to shift them along the x-axis at first. But if you accidentally do, no worries. You can always reset it by opening the gizmo settings and setting the position value back to 0. So now we can move this object around. To do that, we use these little arrows, which represent the X, Y, and Z axis. To scale the object, we use these circular handles along the axis. We can uniformly scale in all directions using this large outer ring. And we can drag the central circle to move the object freely across the screen plane. We can also rotate the object around all 3 axes using these colored rotation rings. Or move the object along a plane by dragging these squares. And we can scale along a plane by dragging these cone-shaped handles. When you hover over any part of the gizmo, the active element highlights in yellow, so you always know exactly what you're about to adjust. Now I can easily position the object the way I want, and then, for example, use the move brush to tweak this hair a bit. And of course, we can remesh everything using Voxel remesher. Let's set a fairly low resolution. Now the model is ready for more sculpting and fine-tuning. Let's make this more visual and add another element. Say, a torus. I'll scale it down. Symmetry is disabled on this object by default, and when you scale it, it scales towards the center. I might delete this later, but for now it's a great example. Let me adjust the hair just a bit more. Okay, so now we have a situation where we're working with multiple objects. The hair, the head, and the band, or ring. I'm not even sure what it is, but let's just say it's something that holds the hair together. Now, back to the gizmo tool. On the left side, you'll see a lock icon. Tap it to open an additional menu. Now we can move or center the gizmo itself without moving the object. This is super helpful when you want to set a custom axis of rotation. Just above that, you'll see some handy buttons for snapping. And one more tip. To isolate any object, you can quickly toggle solo mode. Or just use the eye icons in the scene menu to hide and show objects. Alright, let's do a bit more sculpting on the model. As you can see, today we've covered a solid foundation. Sure, we haven't gone over everything, but this is more than enough for you to start creating your own sculpts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and happy sculpting!